psychiatry, philosophy of medicine, psychiatry, and psychoanalysis. And the title of his talk today is A Short Critical Reflection on Critical Race Theory. This talk will outline some of the strands of critical race theory, ranging from critical legal studies to post-structuralist theory, critical theory, which today is often what is meant by critical theory. The influence of post-structuralism elides many of the approaches, not only ranging from the analytical, dialectical, existential, and phenomenological ones, but also transdisciplinary approaches to the study of race as a human science. In effect, this would be a reflection on an ironic demand for the role of the critical at the meta-theoretical level in critical race theory, and what could also be called efforts to decolonize critical race theory. The latter may seem surprising since critical race theory often offers itself as a decolonial practice. Professor Gordon, welcome.
Thank
I
you.
give you the floor.
Thank you, Ashil. Thank you very much. And also to many of you who have joined us today. I'm delighted to see you. I would also like to begin by giving my condolences to people who have lost loved ones this year. Indeed, has lost loved ones at all. As we know, when it comes to the question of love, the time you have with those you love is always too short. And that's because they're irreplaceable. So I begin with that acknowledgement. As well, I begin also by stating that it's wonderful for me to be speaking at the University of Johannesburg. I was hoping one day to get to visit, but right now we'll do it virtually. One of the things, of course, is that the technologies enable us to traverse physical distance. I don't like to say the word social distance. I find that a very neoliberal concept. That's because neoliberalism is very antisocial. But the thing about the social world is that although we're physically distant, we can take advantage of the technologies to engage in communicative practices that make us socially close. In fact, although these technologies were devised to spy on us, to manipulate us, to get us to buy products, to vote certain ways in elections, right now, the pandemic and the challenges of our times are making us find new ways to use them. And who knows what's going to come out of this? This is part of the sociality of what it is to be a human being. It's what is also talked about in South Africa as Ubuntu. So I'll get into the topic at hand. The first thing, of course, is, critical race theory has made the news these days. And that's because, as you know, the President of the United States tried to make a decree outlawing it. So one of the things you know is when you have a malevolent president trying to outlaw something, you know it's got to be something good. So I'm beginning by saying that although I'll raise some critical questions, my point is not to say dismiss critical race theory. My argument is going to be more about adding to what, in other words, developing what we need to enrich in it. Now, if we're going to talk about critical race theory, what I'm going to do is the first thing that should be obvious, particularly for philosophers, is if you're going to talk about a theory, that is called a meta theory, a theory about a theory. And if one is going to address a theory about a theory, there are many ways in which one can do it. Some people say you will do a philosophy of the theory, but the problem with that is that begs the question of whether philosophy is appropriate as the intellectual framework through which to understand that theory. So what we have to do, the first thing we can do when we're going to look at critical race theory then, is not to presume that philosophy is the appropriate intellectual mechanism or approach through which to look at it. Now, the moment we do this, there's a form of paradox, a form of irony here, because there's already something underway by making the decision that there's not going to be a uniquely privileged or centered approach that would address it. And ironically, that has philosophical implications. So this is one of the paradoxes of philosophy with which I'll begin. And to begin this, I would first outline a concept that I articulate in a book called Disciplinary Decadence. In Disciplinary Decadence, I argue that there's a tendency when we work through our disciplines today, there's a tendency to treat our disciplines as if they're complete, as if they're whole, as if they have the answers to everything. And when we do this, we slide into the realm of idolatry because we treat our discipline as if it were created by a God. And if our discipline were created by a God, that means its methodological framework, indeed its methods, then have a godlike or divine quality. This means then, if the method will already guarantee the outcomes, would already guarantee what we presume to be true, then it means we simply have to follow our method. And this is a practice that has dominated a lot of contemporary human science, and in fact, many areas of the sciences. Many of you who are academics, when you write something, there are people who don't really care about whether what you're saying is true or false. They simply want to know your method. And as long as you follow the orthodoxies of method, then they're satisfied. Of course, the big problem here is that disciplines, at least as we have inherited them, are the products of human actions and thought. So this means we're using a very human, a very imperfect resource under the presumption of its perfection. And this creates the fallacy. This is where you'll see people criticize, for instance, sociologists for not being literary theorists for not being sociological, historians for not being sociological. The historian criticizes the sociologist for not being historical. And you could imagine the list goes on all the way through to the biological. And of course, the philosophers could come in and say, you're not philosophical. But the problem with all of these is that they have not questioned the methodological framework in which they are built. So what happens then is a form of a peculiar problem when the discipline or the method encounters people who don't fit. Now, this is something many of you know in South Africa already. It's all over the United States as well. It's in Canada. It's all over the place. Because when one is stubborn, when one is obstinate about one's discipline and its method, and people don't fit, the tendency is to respond by asking, what is wrong with these people? In effect, then, one turns the people into problems instead of examining the problems the people face. And this tendency to try to squeeze people into a discipline instead of adjust a discipline to the realities of people, that is one of the major fallacies that occur not only in the human sciences, but very specifically in the study of race. Now, there are several other problems that occur in the study of race. One of them, I had the pleasure of talking about this past weekend for the Contemporary Freud Society. And what that problem is that people who talk about race, people who theorize race, are expected to do so in a neurotic way. The neurotic way is to start with the presumption of the illegitimacy of what the theorist is theorizing about. We don't ask a chemist, for instance, to start with the premise of the illegitimacy of the elements. We don't ask a physicist to start with the premise of the illegitimacy of the law of conservation. Yet most people who talk about race are expected to undermine the legitimacy of what they're talking about. Now, this is connected to a basic fact. A lot of what race is linked to is racism. And in a racist society is a society that is both brutal, that is dehumanizing, and at the same time denies its brutality and its dehumanizing practices. So this means that a racist society is a society that prepares you from birth to grave on how to avoid talking about race, and hence the neurosis. So, given those two foundational observations, let me just give a short historical outline of many ways people talked about race, and perhaps some of them would be useful to you, some would be familiar, and perhaps some won't. I'm going to go backwards. And the reason I'm going to go backwards is because what dominates the way people talk about race today is basically critical legal studies. Critical legal studies uh, basically emerged in the United States, connected primarily to a group of legal theorists who were heavily influenced by post-structuralism. And because of a shortness of time, I'm not going to get into details of explaining post-structuralism. I'll just mention the names, the monikers that are connected to it. Those tend to be the names of Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, Pierre Bourdieu, people like that, theorists like that, Lucien Rigouret, etc. And what the critical legal studies people, particularly there are two who are most famous. There are three. One is Richard Delgado, but Derek Bell is perhaps the most famous. And today, because he's passed, after his passing, the person who most represents critical legal studies today across the globe is without question Kimberly Crenshaw. Now, the thing that all the critical legal studies people brought up is a critique of the supposed independence of law. What they, in effect, bring up as a critical question is the relationship of law to societal practices through which law is rendered legitimate or illegitimate. And this is because most of the debate in critical legal studies takes place in legal systems that are governed primarily by Anglo theories of law. And Anglo theories of law are dominated by liberal political theory. And because they're dominated by liberal political theory, they immediately come into a conflict around the question of political theory itself. Now, this is something you're very familiar with in South Africa, because Biko in I Write What I Like is very critical of liberal political theory. And he has very good reason to be critical of liberal political theory, because what many of you may not be aware of is much of the history of liberal political theory was actually against the category of politics. It's against the idea of being political. And this goes all the way back to Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, individuals like those. Because if you look at the way they looked at institutions of power, institutions of around the organization of society, those philosophers and theorists basically moved away from the classical model and the model that's used in a lot of what's today called the global South, of the question of the meeting of society as a place through which, in discursive practices, in speech, in arguing, one ultimately negotiates power for the interests of human flourishing. Instead, you have a shift to governing powers for security, governing powers for contract, governing powers for property, etc. And so what you have in the liberal model is the supervenience of governing instead of political life. And there's a line from Jean-Jacques Rousseau all the way through to Marx, all the way through to people such as Frantz Fanon, and all the way through to Biko that are critical, right? That line is critical of that position because that line basically responds that it is political activity that enables people to reflect upon what brings legitimacy even to law. So if we come back to people like Derek Bell and many of the Richard Delgado and other critical legal studies people, some are connected to South Africa in interesting ways because some of the other people include people such as Drusilla Cornell. One of the things that they brought up is that, in effect, if law disaggregates itself from its relationship to political life, it limits the kinds of questions it can talk about. In other words, the law then separates itself from asking itself a simple, a very basic question, which is the law racist? Now, for you, many of you in South Africa, you immediately see the problem with this. Because if you think back to apartheid South Africa, of course the law was racist. So the idea then to say, no, the law is a separate, uh, um, objective, neutral judging mechanism belies the fact that it's doing so in a society that's designed to do exactly what I described with disciplinary decadence. It's designed to structure a group of people as fundamentally non-people, as excluded, etc. In fact, following the law rigorously would facilitate the dehumanization of those people. So a lot of critical legal studies took race very seriously. And we don't have enough time to get into all the details there, but Kim Crenshaw's uh, uh, addition of intersectionality was very important there because Kimberly Crenshaw pointed out that a legal system can produce harm in how it defines legal subjects. She has a famous example of a collision at an intersection in which if you're going to define the subject as a property owner, but you have made the laws in such a way that certain people cannot own property, then even if there are people who die in the car, there's no harm except for the owner of the car who owns the property. So if one is going to address serious issues of harm, one has to redefine and understand that the legal system, say a Black woman, would have to be able to appear in that legal system as a subject capable, or a citizen, or as a human being capable of being harmed. Now, many people, unfortunately, when they talk about critical race theory, they talk about critical legal studies. But that's not actually the sum total of critical race theory. So I'm going to now go back a little more. And if we go back before the emergence of critical legal studies, we would find that there's been a long history of critical race theory. And that long history of critical race theory can be found not only among African revolutionaries, people such as Amilcar Cabral, Kwame Nkrumah, I already mentioned Biko, but also people like Chabani Mangani in South Africa. But also in the Francophone areas, if we look at people such as Leopold Senghor, or if we look at a person like Sheikh Anta Diop and others. There's always been, in other words, a critical discussion of race. But, and here's the crucial difference. You see, the problem in the United States is a problem that happens in almost any place that emerges as an empire. And that is, whoever is at the center of that empire has the audience of the world. But the mistake they make is they think their circumstance is the circumstance. So during the British Empire, they thought they're Blacks, they're Jews, they're Muslims, you pick whatever category, where their experience was the experience globally. Well, similarly, in the United States, many people treat their experience, their Black experience, as the Black experience. And of course, in apartheid South Africa, that was a similar thing. But you see, a lot of the way I do my work, as many of you may know already who are familiar with my work, is very global. If we want to take seriously a global phenomenon, then travel and meet people and talk about it globally. And I have. And what I've learned is that actually the planet is actually smaller and interconnected. And the issues are such that we'll have to take very seriously that the debates, although they're connected, for instance, in South Africa right now, a lot of people are using Afro-pessimistic debates. What's actually happening is a form of epistemic imperialism through which the experience of the US context is actually being treated as the singular context through which to understand all others. And I would argue that that's a big mistake. It's a big mistake for a variety of reasons. And among those reasons is connected to something I argued in a book called Existentia Africana. And what I argued is this: when people's humanity is systematically denied, it compels them to ask, am I a person? And the direction in which people usually go when they ask that question is they often go to their experience. And I could understand why people turn to their experience, because it reminds you that you're there. But there's a problem with experience. And the problem with experience is that everyone has the experience of trying to figure out their experience. So once we understand that we're trying to figure out our experience, what we often do when we try to figure out our experience is we say, you know what, something just happened. Let me try to figure out what it is. And you always go to talk with somebody else. And that talking with somebody else brings something to the experience. It's called an interpretation, a theory, a meaning. Here we have the problem now of epistemic dependency and epistemic colonization. Because you see, many people, when they're trying to understand their experience, just like when I brought up the critical legal studies people, if every time you're trying to understand your experience, you go to Foucault, Derrida, etc., or for that matter, if you must presume, you go to me or to Afro-pessimists or whatever groups, or Afrocentrists, whatever groups, you're automatically in that action presuming that the theory they developed from their experience, okay, is going to be applicable to yours. And it could be. It's not that it isn't. It's not that it's necessarily false. It's just that if you don't theorize out of your experience, then you're in effect saying that another person's experience is more valid than your own. In other words, if they took the time to theorize their experience, to offer an interpretation to the world, you should as well. And if they converge, then great. But if they diverge, then you need to ask why. And this becomes the crucial element. So if we go back to people, not only Biko, but if we go back to people like Fanon, and we go back to people like W.B. Du Bois, and we go back to people like the Haitian Antoine Firmin, or the African-American theorist Anna Julia Cooper, and we could even go back further, all the way back to Kugano, the Fanti from Ghana in the 18th century, we'll notice something very peculiar. And I'm going to quickly, for the sake of time, bring up those peculiar things. The first thing is what they have in common. And it's something that I talk about in a book called An Introduction to Africana. And by the way, excuse me, when I'm addressing South African audiences, it's spelled Africana. It's not Afrikaner, it's Africana, means African diasporic philosophy. There's something that connects us all in the Euro-modern era. Whether you're an African philosopher, Afro-Caribbean philosopher, African-American philosopher, I don't like to say African-American because they're really talking about the US, African US, because there are African-Canadians, there are Afro-Mexicans, etc. There are Afro-Europeans, there are Afro-Asians. But what we find in common is that what colonialism does is to impose upon a group of people mechanisms of disempowerment. And once we understand what that's about, mechanisms of disempowerment take certain forms. The short version is they take at least 3 forms. The first form is to question your humanity. It's to disempower your ability to act as a human being. And that is what racism fundamentally is about. And because of that, racism leads to the question, not only politically and theoretically, but also philosophically, of what it means to be a human being. Okay? Now, some people claim they're anti-human, they're against being human, all of that stuff. The Afro-pessimists claim this stuff too. They say things like, the black is not human, blah, blah, blah. But that's a conflation of how a human being is treated from what a human being is. If black people weren't human, we wouldn't be angry. We wouldn't be pissed at our dehumanization. And so that question of what it is to be a human being goes to the next question. Because to disempower people, you have to block their capacity to act, which means you have to limit not only their liberty, but you also have to put constraints on their freedom. And many people, particularly in the Anglo tradition, don't know the distinction between liberty and freedom. The short version is liberty is an absence of shackles, of impediments, of blockage. But freedom can have constraints. Freedom is about the responsibility over one's actions. And that's why freedom tends to be linked to politics. Because if you have political life, it brings along with it political responsibility. Now, the thing is, freedom is also connected to a metaphysical question. Because you see, without freedom, there's no possibility. So in other words, there's no point talking about liberation. There's no point talking about transformation. There's no point talking about revolution if there's not possibility. And so what we discover is an interesting debate, because the first one is saying, in reality, what am I, or what are we? But some people say you could only understand what you are if you understand what you're doing, what are you to become. But freedom requires that possibility. But how can you be free if you don't understand what is being freed? So the symbiotic connection between the two leads to the third question. And the third one is straightforward, because you see, the third one is about justification. The conversation I've been articulating so far comes down to the observation that intellectual resources, from science to philosophy to political theory, all the way through many mechanisms of thought, if thought is used to rationalize dehumanization and colonialism and on freedom, this leads to a crisis of thought. And this crisis of thought comes down to this. Is reason any longer justifiable? Or to put differently, is justification any longer justifiable? And the reason this question comes up is because we know the people who implemented colonialism, enslavement, racism, all of them, if you go and read their history, their literature, their way of thinking, they all claim to defend freedom. If you go back and look at the writings from apartheid South Africa, all of the thinkers, all of the intellectuals from that period who supported the dehumanizing state claimed they were proponents of freedom. So the conundrum is, why is it that in a system in which there are people publicly committed to freedom, there's a systematic structuring of the denial of it? And that becomes the central critical question. So that earlier race theory was also a critical theory, because for that third element, it led to a critique of theory itself. And that means, and it's so radical a critique, that it's also a critique of critique. So we need to ask, what is that critique of the critique? Well, that critique of critique is what today you could call the decolonizing of theory. Because you see, many of you are familiar with decoloniality, etc. You know, you can have colonization, decolonization, excuse me. But when you have decolonization, there's a problem. Many of you have experienced it not only in South Africa, but you've seen this happen with the neighbors in Mozambique, in Zimbabwe, in Namibia, all across the continent. And this is the problem. The problem is, although there could be a declaration of a post-colonial society, of a post-apartheid society in South Africa's case, the problem is that the institutions of power had presumed their independence of the system. So the universities, the structure of parliament, the churches, the religious institutions, the economy, all of those were presumed independent. But if they're independent, you know what that means? It means that as the change occurs, they don't have to, because they presumed they were on the outside, just like in critical legal studies, the legal system presumed it was outside, when in fact the history was the entire legal system was rallied to produce that dehumanizing society. So once that's the case, it means then the critical question becomes, what kind of university, what kind of economy, what kind of governing system, what kind of political order, what kind of the organization of power is suitable for a society committed to the empowering of people, to the transformation from dehumanization to humanization? Well, this then brings us back to what racism is about. Because you see, many people, when we talk about racism, want to move to do so within exclusively the liberal paradigm. But in that paradigm, it individualizes the issue, it moralizes the issue, and it's allergic to politics. But the problem is that politics is about power. And if racism is about the use of power to disempower others, then to fight against racism requires the use of power to re-empower others. And this then means that one needs to define what power is. Well, I'm going to just simply say that what power is the ability to make things happen and having access to the conditions of doing so. If that's the case, then the ability to get rid of racism, to transform a racist society, requires access to the conditions, in this case, the political institutions, the mechanisms of power to do so. So this means that empowering people, right, from the damage of a racist society requires political action. It requires political thinking. It requires, if we get back to the meta critique of reason and the critique of how we deal with justification, it requires then an actual political theory. Now, this is a very tricky thing to do when we think through post-structuralism, because post-structuralism has really become the dominant way of thinking about theory. Many of you, for instance, have heard the term critical theory, and there are many kinds of critical theory. There's 19th century there's 18th century critical theory from Immanuel Kant. There's 19th century critical theory that you could find from Hegel to Marx, etc. But as I've just pointed out, there's also been all along Black critical theory that you could find from Cugano to Haynes to Furman, all the way through to Du Bois, Fanon, and others. But at the same time, as we think through these mechanisms of what it is to have critical theories, today what has happened is, you see, in the 70s into the 80s and the 90s, post-structuralism in its textual, genealogical, and archaeological form dominated theory. And it got to the point where, for some people, even to think theory is to think in a post-structuralist way. But the problem is that post-structuralism was organically linked also to the rise of neoliberalism. And this created a crisis of post-structuralism. Because you see, if post-structuralism is going to be the better political alternative, then one has to ask why did it function in such a way that it was so well aligned with the mechanisms of a neoliberal and a predominantly colonial university? And this was very embarrassing for post-structuralism. How do we know this? Because when was the last time any of you met someone who said the words, "I am a post-structuralist"? And in fact, what had happened has been a rebranding of post-structuralism. And the rebranding of post-structuralism took the form of critical theory. Today, a lot of people who say they do critical theory are just doing post-structuralism rebranded. It's the same arguments, genealogical, textual, etc. And we even find in certain forms of decolonial theory post-structuralism, because we find genealogical post-structuralism. You just replace the word power with the word coloniality. Of course, there's a difference with decolonial theory, because when you think about critical theory, if you go to most meetings that say critical theory, you already know it's going to be a predominantly white audience. But if you go to a meeting that says decolonial theory, you know you're going to have a majority multiracial audience with a lot of people from the global South. And so this raises an important meta question for critical race theory, because it means then that if you put the question of colonization to the forefront of the meta theory, then it increases the probability that you can begin to give an interrogation of whether the theory itself is ironically racially alienating. So there's a lot more I could say on this issue, but the thing is, we have a limited time. I could talk about the distinction between analytical, phenomenological, hermeneutical, and many other forms of ways of dealing with the meta theory of a critical race theory. But for now, I think I'll stop here, because it's very important for the audience to be able to pose some questions that could illuminate those concerns. Thank you.
Thank you for your very stimulating talk. And yes, it is time for audience questions. And what we try to do in this Colloquium series is give our students the first round of questions. So if there are any students in today's audience, I see some names here. Please, I don't think you can raise your hand. I don't think there's a hand raising function, but you can unmute yourself and say hello.
I see someone, I see some stuff in the chat on the side. There is usually a function that enables you to do it.
Yes. Sorry, there is a hand raising function. I've just seen that one of my colleagues, Pierre Pierre has his hand up, but Pierre, I'm going to ask you to wait a few minutes until the students have the first go. Let me look at
I see a
the
Patricia
chats.
Mapipi. Is she a student?
I don't know. Look, let's go with the chat function for now while we let the students warm up. And I think I'm going to read this because this video
Sure.
is also on YouTube, and I don't think the chat functions appears on the YouTube. So there's a question from Riva Foreman. Brilliant macro approach as opposed to micro-nationalist stance predominant in the world today. I think that's just a comment. Then Patricia, it seems like disempowerment is a form of gaslighting on a mass scale. In other words, the denial of the humanity of the other and making them question their reality. What are your thoughts on that?
Patricia, that means you got it. That's absolutely correct. In fact, all racist societies do gaslighting. The idea is to get you not to be able to admit what you see. This is one of the reasons why in a lot of my writings on race and racism, I talk about the concept of bad faith. Bad faith is is a form of lie to the self, not only in an effort to evade our freedom, but to make us believe what we don't believe. And so one of the things that racism, what's involved in the institutional political practice of racism is to get human beings to believe they're not human beings. And that gaslighting practice makes you not trust your judgment. It makes you not trust evidence. It undermines your ability to be critical. I could add to that an additional element, because I noticed you mentioned also the other. Frantz Fanon, and not only Frantz Fanon, but I've also argued in many others, point out that a human world is dialectical. And by dialectical, what that means is that no human being is a god, which means all of us, each of us, is in an incomplete relationship with another human being. This means that we deal with contradictions all the time. But what racism attempts to do is to reduce one group of human beings into universals and then and treat them as absolute presence or being, and another group of human beings as absolute absence of that being. And so they become absolute non-being. And that's the logic of contraries. If you think about apartheid, apartness, that's the reason why racisms tend to be forms of segregation. It's to say one group is completely separate from another. Of course, the problem, as Fanon pointed out, and Biko pointed this out too, is that you can't really keep people that apart without having a force in between. And in many racist states, that's the police. And so this collision is what produces the violence. But the thing is, there's something deeper at work. And that is, as long as human beings have speech and communication, it connects back to that point I said about sociality and physical distance, then there's going to be interaction, and speech is dialectical. But the thing about speech, and this is what scares all racists, speech is intimate. Although I'm here across the Atlantic Ocean, every word I say, because we're part of the same community, the human world, every word is not only out there, it's inside of you. And when you speak, it's inside of me. The intimacy, that intimacy makes all speech ultimately, and this is something all racist societies are afraid of this, erotic. And that's why racist societies are obsessed with anti-miscegenation, etc., because they want to purge themselves of the other. But to do that, they have to lie about the other. The lie is that the other, the racialized other, is not even an other. In other words, there's the self, the other, and then there are those who are not selves and not others. But now there's a problem that comes up. And here's the problem. The problem has to do with existence. Human beings are not actually beings. Being doesn't work for humanity. Beings work for chairs and stones and things like that. But what a human being is actually a negation of being. And that negation creates an upsurge through which we're able to have meaning, communication, etc. So existence, and that's what existence means. It means to stand out, to stand from being. The Japanese philosopher Nishitani says it beautifully. He said the problem with being is that it covers reality. So if we come back to reality, what racism wants to do is to cover reality, to hide it. You know, in the beginning when I said that there's a neurotic element of racism, the neurotic element is to try to get you to devalue being critical of it, raising evidence about it, talking about it. Well, reality, it turns out, is greater than being. And because of this, many of you, every one of you in this audience, you're aware of this because you realize no matter how much you try to contain reality in theoretical mechanisms, in disciplines, etc., reality always exceeds it. And that exceeding of being, that is the clue to freedom. So if we can understand this, then we understand that it's not about being the other, because at least another has the possibility of an ethical relationship. The problem is about being denied even otherness. And to fight against that means you have to put to the side the egological models and get into the political actions of realizing that the work to be done, as one commentator brought out, is not about me. It's about always, when you do political action, it's always about what transcends the self. And it comes to the community. It comes to the us, but the us understands with humility that the us is part of reality, but not its entirety.
Thank you for that question. And Patricia has confirmed she is a student. She's from UCT. And Pierre has also confirmed. Pierre has also confirmed that the hand-raising function works. So just another minute or two for students. Your questions. I know we have quite a few postgraduate students in philosophy who would be interested in this kind of talk.
I see Shahid as a question, Shahid Mathey.
Yes, Shahid is a student for life, just like me, but not a registered student. Shahid, I'll get you. There are a few people before you, but I do see your question. Okay, look, students, the invitation is open. You can jump in at any time. But for now, I'm going to go to, before Shahid, Veli Matova has a question. Veli, you can use your microphone if you'd like.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Professor Gordon, and welcome to UJ, so to speak. On behalf of the department, great to finally have you.
Yeah, I have a cousin there, by the way.
Great.
She's on leave right now, Claudia Gastro.
Okay, great. Well, you definitely invited. You mentioned that you wanted to be here. Please, as soon as things unlock, you're most welcome here. So my question is, so I'm coming from an epistemic injustice point of view and epistemic decolonization as well. And going back to your neurotic point, right? I was wondering whether we shouldn't add a more kind of distinctively fourth dimension, epistemic dimension to disempowerment. I mean, obviously the epistemic thread's running right through your three dimensions of disempowerment. But I was wondering what you feel about the talk. So now that people have brought up gaslighting, but the recent talk about the epistemic exploitation, for example. So the way as a white person, you can force a black person to continuously justify their experiences, right? Simply because the dominant norm is white. And how exhausting. I'm not sure whether you've read any of the stuff from.
I have. I'm very critical of the stuff, particularly.
Okay. Brilliant. So maybe I'll just leave it there and find out what you feel about epistemic exploitation and why you're critical.
Well, there's several things. There's several things. The first criticism is hypocrisy. A lot of the people who develop the epistemic injustice stuff, it's very peculiar. These are mostly white people who are using ideas from Black people, and then they go to places like South Africa and they only meet with white people and they claim they're dealing with injustice. So there's the first charge, the problem of hypocrisy. If they're really interested in epistemic justice, then go read some of the work of Black people. Read some of the work of Dalits in India and Pakistan. Read the work of indigenous peoples. Read the work of decolonial theorists. But don't keep reinforcing ad infinitum over and over the work of a small set of white analytical philosophers. That is epistemic racism. Okay, so at first, when I make the charge of hypocrisy, some may say it's ad hominem, but it's not an ad hominem. It's precisely because all it is actually a call for epistemic openness in practice. A good example of their failure to do so is that these arguments aren't new. For instance, when I wrote Phenomenon of the Crisis of European Man back in the 90s, I pointed out that racism demands a form of epistemic closure. Epistemic closure is when, in knowing the identity of a person, you know all you need to know. And thus, you no longer work in the interrogative to learn from that person. So if you say that's a woman, that ends the story. That is epistemic closure. If you say that's a Black person, nothing more to know. That's epistemic closure. However, if you have epistemic openness, so my argument is not against epistemology, okay? My argument is something deeper. When I spoke earlier about disciplinary decadence, the response to disciplinary decadence, I argue, is a teleological suspension of disciplinarity. What that means is you have to be willing to go beyond your discipline for the sake of reality. So if you're actually committed to, say, being open epistemologically, you have to be willing to go beyond analytical philosophy, beyond European continental philosophy. You have to be able to make yourself epistemologically vulnerable and take the courage to learn from others. So that's the first part. But there's a deeper argument, a more complex argument, because that part is pretty easy. There's a fellow by the name of Contant Ryabalka, for instance, wrote Against Epistemic Apartheid. And what he means by that is this notion that you stay in your world epistemologically, I stay in mine, and things are fine. But I've already given the argument that communicative practice, dialectical practices are needed. There has to be a communication across different intellectual spectra. So if we understand that, it means we have to treat our arguments as not hermetically sealed. It means we have to put them in communicative practice, which means it's not about even interdisciplinarity. It's about transdisciplinarity. And by that means that one has to get into the communication to learn from what others have to say, including disciplinarily, through which one can have a better relationship with reality. But there's another argument, and this is something I talk about in a book that I just wrote called Freedom, Justice, and Decolonization. And the other argument is in the word justice. You see, a lot of the people who use the term epistemic justice or injustice presuppose that the normative framework is justice. But a lot of the ways in which they talk about justice is couched in liberal theories of justice, whether it's John Rawls, whether it's Dworkin, whether you can go through the long list. But the problem is they have never interrogated at the radical metacritical level justice itself as a category. For instance, when I gave that argument earlier about legal systems, such as the apartheid state's legal system, they would argue that they were going through acts of justice. So the question is justice a sufficient normative category at institutional levels to handle this kind of problem? And that's the kind of question they don't ask. And it's not to say, in other words, they commit a sort of fallacy Because you see, within analytical philosophy, many people will presume you're actually doing philosophy if you have an epistemological framework. But that goes back to a period in the history of philosophy that made as a philosophia prima, the first philosophy from Descartes onwards, epistemology. But the problem with that is that there's already a fallacy at the heart of much of epistemology. In other words, it's not that epistemology should never be done. It's just like when I gave the critique of ontology, responding to Shahid's point, that the critique of Heidegger and many of those, it's not that you can never do ontology. The mistake is to do ontology in a disciplinarily decadent way, to make it reach beyond its scope. The similar thing happens with epistemology. The similar thing happens with also the way people talk about justice. So what I actually argue for is a decolonization of normative life. And the decolonization of normative life means that there are concepts that are not translatable into justice, precisely because justice is a subset of a larger constellation of normative life. If you look, for instance, at what's often translated as justice, which is the Greek concept dikaisune. Dikaisune doesn't mean justice. It includes justice, but it's not identical with it. Dikaisune is actually more connected to ma'it, which is an ancient East African concept. And that ancient East African concept points out something very interesting. It connects balance, truth, justice, breath, life, more. And before the Christianizing of Ubuntu, it is a similar concept. Ubuntu is broader than the Christian notions of equality and dignity. It's greater than that. And one of the things, if we're going to decolonize knowledge and decolonize normative terms, it means we now need to let go of the idea that one applies a set of fixed philosophical category to the study of a people or certain concepts, because that would be an effort to squeeze them into those concepts, and instead let go and adjust the relationships to understand what the challenges are in the reality of the lives, not only of those people, but the questions they generate beyond themselves, such as, for instance, how do we deal with planetary life on the planet today? So I would argue then that we don't have to abandon epistemology. We need to put it in a proper perspective. And I would argue that if we're really committed to doing this, we should actually reach out to learn from others. One final point, not exclusively final, but a point I want to add here, is that we also need to abandon a way of thinking that automatically creates a kind of naive structuralism that always places white people at the superior. One of the greatest fears of racism is ultimately the irrelevance of racists. And what I mean by that is, if we do the political work to change the mechanisms of power, then even if there is a racist white person, that person's just irrelevant. It means you can now get on to the practices that need to be done. But this means that one has to let go of certain ideas about how we understand whiteness. One of the things that I would encourage all of you to do is to go and look up psychological studies of malignant narcissism. You could find that in a Mayo Clinic. You could look in many psychological associations, but just look up malignant narcissism. Once you've looked up malignant narcissism, replace the word narcissist with the word white. And what you will discover is that every symptom of malignant narcissism matches structurally white people. It's not that individual white peoples are necessarily narcissists. It's that white people as a structural category is a structure of malignant narcissism. Presumed superiority, presumed right to have everything, presume that if they don't get what they believe they're entitled to, they're victimized, presume they're the only legitimate voice in the room. The list is long. White people, people legally designated white, have the ability to give up that stuff. If one takes a position of humility, one understands that from the political perspective, the issue isn't about whether you're a white person. The issue is about whether you're engaged in actions that would actually foster the production of freedom in your society. And this is where I think Biko was insightful, because Biko pointed out that Black consciousness was a political issue precisely because a racist state wants to block the capacity of people to be critical of it, which means it must block the capacity of speech. Once we understand that, it means whether you're white, Black, or brown, if you're going to engage the speech that is critical of that state-sanctioned activity, you become a target of that state. Now, once we understand this, if we bring it, let me use the United States as an example. In the United States, there's a lot of debate right now over Black Lives Matter. But what I actually point out to people is that Black Lives Matter is actually a fight for democracy. Because any society that calls itself a democracy that's structured on the exclusion of Black people is contradicting what democracy is about. I think it's a healthy thing in the world today that there are people who have taken to the streets of all racial backgrounds precisely because what they realize is that fascism, which always has racism and xenophobia connected to it, fights against people's capacity to live freely in the open. And so ultimately, they're in the streets, not out of saying Black lives are superior to any other lives, because what Black Lives Matter was saying is that we're sick and tired of being in a society that treats white lives as mattering more than every other kind of life. But what's crucial here is that there are people understanding that ultimately what that would create in white people would be the license of malignant narcissism, the license to do whatever whiteness wants to everybody else. But some people can say, I don't want to have that license. In fact, nobody should have a license to dehumanize others. So if you're going to fight against having that license, it means you have to join with those under the heels of those who have that license. And this is why it's political, because when something's political, it means you fight together. And this fighting together means you have to let go of narcissism, let go of the ego, and we have to struggle for it, for what would be cultivating a world of freedom and dignity. And so that's, I know it's a longer answer there, but it connects a lot of these issues, because the problem I have with a lot of the epistemic justice arguments is that they're disciplinarily decadent. The practitioners tend to be hypocritical, and they tend to fall into a framework in which they're actually reinforcing the very logic, the very disciplinary logic, without questioning whether that logic itself was productive of the exclusions they're criticizing.
Thank you. Totally agreed on all 3 points.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm looking forward for us hanging out when I'm able to come back, since, you know, I'm a global child. I'm a child of was born in Jamaica, but I also have biological as well, family in South Africa. Among my homes is South Africa, and also India, because I'm also Tamil Indian. Okay.
Thanks.
Sure.
Thanks for that. We have several questions in the chat function. I'm going to read one at a time, Professor, and then you can respond to them one at a time.
Sure.
So Shahid, sorry, you've been waiting for a long time, Shahid, for a response. Very interesting that humanity is not being. Does that speak to Heidegger? If yes, how?
Okay. Could we read some of the others too? Because that way the audience could get to hear their questions.
Okay.
And even if I don't get to answer them, they themselves can be thinking about them beyond that, because that's also a
Yes.
decolonial practice.
Amara, who is a PhD student at our department. Thank you for this lecture, Professor Gordon. I have two questions. One, in a society where institutional racism thrived in the past, like apartheid South Africa, which impoverished the native South Africans who now may justifiably require the program of affirmative action to recover, how can affirmative action be legalized and implemented without it translating to what some nowadays call reverse racism or reverse apartheid? Two, how can critical race theory make a change in the society outside the academia? And then Patricia again says, thank you for your insights on the subject of otherness, Dr. Gordon, Professor Gordon. I would argue that the racist is actually suffering from a form of insecurity and projects their fears, inadequacies, etc., through a racist outlet. We really hope to have you in South Africa sometime soon. Smiley face. Smiley emoticon, is that what it's called now? Riva Foreman says everyone is automatically a repository of the path they have. We have to overcome this, quote unquote, intellectually, as the professor epitomizes. And Yongiza says Steve Biko was very critical of the liberalists, and correctly so. And the experiences I got from being in the university is that the majority of universities, if not all, are seriously engaged in the liberal politics and ways of framing our thinking. Thus, meaning that every progress we make in terms of knowledge production and decolonization of knowledge, it's them who decide what changes must occur and to what extent. I am of the view that all the universities in South Africa are universities in South Africa and not South African universities in thought and knowledge production, which would bring them epistemic justice and balance and not marginalize and exclude people. It's a comment from a Wits University student. Thank you. Professor, do you want to respond to some or all of that?
Sure. No, to all of them. Well, the first thing is, in my earlier response to Professor Velimitova's question, I respond to the Heideggerian question. The problem with Heidegger, for instance, Heidegger claims that only Europeans do philosophy because Europeans actually engage in ontology and epistemology, and that is fallacious. One of the immediate response is that philosophy is ultimately about dealing with truth and reality. But the thing about truth and reality is that reality is greater than ontology. It's greater than epistemology. It's greater than being. So once one understands that there's been philosophy all over the world, all over antiquity. And in fact, when I teach philosophy, I often start with the work of Antef, which was approximately, let me get this right, 1,000 years before even the pre-Socratics in Athens and in Ionia. So what this tells us is this: if you look at someone like Sri Aurobindo in India, I mentioned Nishitani Kaiji, and there are others I could bring up. The main thing is that if one is attuned to addressing the question of reality, then one is engaged in the larger theoretical enterprise, and one could see that there's a pernicious element involved in being. And one of the things that's involved in being that we could think seriously about is that the being talk tends to also lead to Theodician talks. And for those who are not familiar with theodicy, theodicy is connected to the idea of the being of God. And what often happens, what it is that religious people and theologians tend to take the position that God is simultaneously omnipotent, omniscient, in other words, all-knowing, all-powerful, but all good. The problem then is, if God is all good, all-knowing, and all-powerful, then why is there evil in the world? So what happens is, from the being way of thinking, one has to account for the goodness of God in the face of evil. And you all have had this conversation in some form or another. I'm sure you've argued with your parents about this. And the parent usually says two classic responses. Who the hell are you to question God? That first response basically says that you're finite, God is infinite, you don't know what you're talking about. The second response is God gave us free will, and then we screwed it up. Now, if you notice the logic there, both moves they take God off the hook. Okay? Well, the problem is if we secularize theodicy, if we don't use God, we can substitute God with other concepts. We could substitute God with the economy. Capitalism, for instance, is always a theodicy. In other words, no matter how much poverty, how much brutality, how much inequality is produced by capitalism, capitalists would ultimately argue the same way with the theodician arguments. You've not had it enough yet. You'll see how it'll work itself out. Or they'll say, your knowledge is limited, the market knows more. In other words, they turn the market into a god. Similar thing happens with certain systems in terms of how we think about knowledge. It's one thing for science to be understood as science, but it's another thing to ontologize science, to turn it into the absolute reality. The problem is then we subordinate reality to the materialism of science when reality is greater than the question of its material components. We see similar arguments with society. All nationalisms, as an example, would argue that ultimately the society is just and good. The problem is the people in the society. Okay? Now, this is what comes from being talk. And there are people like Nishitani Kaiji, as an example, who point out that being talk tend to be linked to egological talk. And this is one of the reasons why we've inherited a way of thinking that's linked into this notion of an individual premised on the idea of being like a god. And that godlike individual is more of that being ontology talk. This is why it leads to resentment. Some people think if they don't get something, there's something wrong with the world. And that's the end of the story. When they never ask whether the issue at hand is about something greater than themselves. Okay? So now, when we get into the question of how we talk about issues such as affirmative action and many of those those other concerns, are one of the things that we should bear in mind is that the immediate problem you have when you argue about affirmative action is that you're presenting it to people who may not have questioned the illegitimacy of the society they lived in the first place. Think about it. If their society was just, then that would mean that the settlers' possessions are just. It would mean that the system that was excluding, right, a lot of Black people, as an example, was just. If that is the case, then it means that their inclusion would be an act of injustice. You see the logic? And that is why they immediately retreat to the argument of reverse discrimination. But this is part of the malignant narcissism. Because you see, the issue is the idea that what's being questioned is whether those people who possess all those things were entitled to those things in the first place. This is one of the reasons why there's the next move, the next bad faith move, to refer to the discrimination as the past. But that's BS. There's no past discrimination in South Africa. There's discrimination today. In the United States of America, they kept talking about past discrimination. George Floyd was not suffering from past discrimination. Breonna Taylor was not suffering from past discrimination. A lot of those Black people are dying from the pandemic. A lot of those were dying from the COVID-19 pandemic, from an unequal medical system of the administering of healthcare. That's not past. Donald Trump could say all you like as he's trying to gut away people's healthcare. His butt is kept alive from public resources that should be available to everybody. So one of the things we need to deal with are twofold. The first thing is we have to get rid of the past discrimination language. That's just nonsense. And everybody knows this. The second thing is we have to rethink the very language. You see, affirmative action has a problem. And you know what the problem with affirmative action is? It works. You see, the society that's not committed to being transformed, if affirmative action didn't work, they wouldn't be upset. But if you look at the language they sneak into affirmative action about qualifications, etc. Let me tell you something about qualifications. Whenever I'm in South Africa, by the way, I go to South Africa. I'm normally in South Africa all the time. I was last in South Africa actually in early March. And I was, before then, I was in South Africa in January. I go to South Africa often, mostly to see relatives, but also to speak. But one of the things that what I find absolutely offensive is that it's often brought up in South Africa, it's brought up in the United States as well, that white people built everything. White people are uniquely gifted in such a way that there's white wealth, and it's unjust to now to distribute this among all of these unqualified, undeserving people of color, particularly Black people. But the problem is that's a distortion of history. I often have to remind people in South Africa that most white people didn't build crap. It's Black labor, brown labor, Asian labor. That's what built a lot of that. And then they'd say, but how about the knowledge, the technology, etc.? That's also not true. When I teach my classes in the United States, I often remind them, one of the ways you gaslight people, as an earlier questioner brought up, is also to misrepresent their history. So let me tell you a little story that could give you some insight into this. About 120 years ago, W.B. Du Bois asked Franz Boas, a German Jewish physicist who became a cultural anthropologist. He wrote a lot against racism. He invited Boas to speak at the historical Black College, Atlanta University, for the commencement. And he wanted Boas to speak on race. And Boas said, Black students are smart. They know how to read. They could always read my writings on race. Boas said, I want to talk about African history. And at that moment, Du Bois said, what? He said, what do you mean African history? Because at that point, Du Bois had bought into the nonsense that enslavement and colonization civilized Africans, and that all around him were these great achievements by white people, and that indigenous peoples and Black people just are passive recipients of. And Boas said, no, if you think about the human species have been around approximately a little over 200,000 years. Some say 300,000. Most of those years, right, were spent on the continent of Africa. It means that the great revolutions, from language to writing to cooking to all the way through to architecture to medicine, he goes the long list, were developed on the continent of Africa and then spread through to Asia and Europe. And he said, Africa, it's one of the greatest assaults on African people, on Black people, the African diaspora, but though their Black people are not African, but are from ancient Africans like the Australian indigenous peoples or the Maori and people like those. He said the damage done to them is to make them believe that they were never agents of history. But if you know the actual history, you would have a completely different attitude to understand who built things. And at that moment, Du Bois was like, that's what led to him trying to develop the Encyclopedia Africana. But here's the crucial thing. I often say to my students, imagine what your day would be like if you didn't have Black people in history. And we have to bear in mind that a lot of the people who are enslaved and brought over to the US were not brute stupid labor, as they say. These were people who were skilled labor. They were people who, in their communities, were physicians, architects, agronomists. There were people in their communities who brought that knowledge over into what became the Americas. And that's why the Americas flourished. And they continued that ingenuity, and they creolized it, mixed it in with the indigenous peoples in the Americas. And that's why, for instance, if you were to get up this morning and you turned on your light, well, the filament in that light bulb, it wasn't Edison who developed the light bulb. It was his laboratory. It was Latimer, the black man working in there, who did that. If you drove to work, the brakes in the car were developed by a black person. Toilets, doorknobs, the list goes on and on and on. What we fail to understand, even the cotton gin for the cotton that many of you are using, was developed by an enslaved black person. The problem was there was a system that blocked a lot of black people from owning patents. And so the person in history who was listed as the creator of it was white. But a lot of the actual, not only work, but the creativity were from people who are not white. It's not to say that there aren't white people who invented things. The error we make is the racial segregation of creativity. The truth is, human beings are creative. Black, brown, whatever color you want to choose, people create things. But so within that framework, the fact of the matter is that what built a lot of the world around us was actually many peoples, but certain group of people are excluded from the historical recognition for their labor and their creativity. And so that is the fundamental injustice. And once we understand that, we begin to understand that the continued systematic blocking of people from being able to bring to the table their creativity, their activity, that is the ongoing problem. So it means that if we're going to deal with that, we're going to have to think outside of the box. We're going to have to, you see, although affirmative action can make certain corrections, it also has a limitation. And its limitation is that it's a mechanism that's designed within liberal political theory to maintain the system. But the problem is greater than the question of simply adding some people in. Let me put it in the context of gender. Many have argued that if you simply put women in, you are correcting gender discrimination. But if you have a system designed for the exclusion of women, the only way women can be in there is as anatomical females who are structurally males. Well, it's a similar thing done to Black people, as an example. The idea is for Black people to fit in. Black people could be legally designated Black, but must be for all other purposes, white. So that means that's a way of maintaining a system through the illusion of addressing its inequities. However, that is based on a flawed conception of what a human being is. If a human being were a thing, like the way I could hold up this cup, then you could put it in my hand and it still remains that cup. But I've already pointed out that a human being is not a being. What human beings technically are relationships. So that means that if a relationship goes into an institution that's another relationship, that requires transforming that relationship. So if you go back to the female example, it means for her actually to get in there, that institution as a male-dominated institution has to be transformed, which means males have to be changed. Well, similarly, if one is going to transform an institution premised upon racial exclusion, that means those whose identity requires it, their relationship has to change, which means new kinds of people have to be born. And these new kinds of people, these new kinds of relationships require building different organizations and institutions. And these different organizations and institutions are going to be organizations and institutions that are not mimetic. In other words, they should not be imitations of what preceded them. The problem we're having, just as one of the questioners rightfully point out, is that we persist in building, if we pick education as an example, institutions of higher learning that are imitations of colonial institutions. What we need is the creativity of building new kinds of institutions that are designed for the purpose of creating new ways of people living together. And this is something Fanon observed, but not only Fanon, because there was also a conservative who observed this. The conservative's name was Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche had this concept called the last man. The last man is the man who believes that there cannot be anything beyond him. And what Nietzsche argued as the antidote for the last man was the Übermensch, the overman, the man who was over himself, the man who understands that beyond him, there's more to come. Now, Europe developed the mentality of the last man. The United States has the mentality of the last man. Trump, all fascisms believe they're the last man, because what the last man believes is that the end of him is the end of the world. This is the reason why we're in a period of such radical nihilism, because what happens is we're dealing with people who are gutting our planet, gutting our economies, gutting life itself, because they're not interested in life beyond their own. They're not even interested in the lives of their children. But if you have humility and you understand that you get over yourself, if you're over the narcissism of being the last man, then you are the last nation or the last people, then you understand that you have to step out of the way for new kinds of people to emerge, for new generations to emerge, for different ways of living to emerge. And we're witnessing that now in a very complex struggle. For instance, there are trans people in the world today. Now, in the past, they were called by different names, but today, trans people are connected to concepts like transdisciplinarity. They're challenging the very idea of what we think about what it is to be a human being in anatomical or physical terms. But we have to understand that they're also in relational terms, because if you're a trans human being, it means that the relationships you have with other human beings are different than those of the past. It means that one has to be guided by new social mechanisms, different ways, and organize society in ways that may have to address its mythopoetic framework. So, to put that, to bring it home, it means then that we should think beyond those and start thinking in a more revolutionary way of how we're going to organize a society that's actually livable for humanity to come.
Thank you for that. So we unfortunately ran out of time. We could go on this, speak about this for many more hours. It's been very stimulating and very, very interesting. And I thank our audience for their questions. One last comment from YouTube, actually. It's Shetan Maharaj, who says, great topic and great talk, Professor Lewis Gordon.
Thank you.
We hope to see you in person in South Africa post lockdown in the new world that emerges 2021, 2022. Who knows what's in store, but we do hope to see you here, and we'd be glad to host you in person at the physical University of Johannesburg. I hope you enjoy your morning. I know it's morning there.
It is, yeah.
Yes, and thank you for giving us such a vigorous talk and for engaging with us so thoroughly. It's been a great morning.
Well, thank you. And I look forward to seeing my cousins, my nephews, my nieces, And in addition to that, whenever I come to South Africa, I'm always greeted properly, which is welcome home. So I'm looking forward to returning home.
Yes. So from home, goodbye and thank you for your talk.
Thank you. Take care. Okay. And to everybody, continue being safe and healthy. And remember, despite the difficulty of the times, despite how dire and difficult it is, find moments of joy to remind you of your humanity, because in that will be your resilience to do what they said in Mozambique, a luta continua, to continue the struggle. Thank you.